Hi, everybody. I'm Daphna Laifenfeld, and I'm going to continue, I guess, the medical trend in this session. And I'll talk about beyond what is visible to the human eye. So specifically, I head the personalized medicine group at Teva. And so when we think about personalized medicine, we're really talking about tailoring medical treatments to the individual's characteristics, needs, preferences. You can see a lot of features already within the definition. And the way that we do that is through markers, basically. So whether these are biological or digital markers, ultimately what we want to do is collect enough information that will enable us to define somehow the patient that is in front of us and predict some of the events that are going to happen to that patient so that we can manage them and help him manage their disease. And so we apply various machine learning and artificial intelligence methodologies on all types of data. So clinical data, biological data, as well as sensor data or digital data. And I'll try to give you, if time permits, two examples basically that in which we use clinical data and then digital data in order to predict exacerbations in asthma. So I'm not going to go into a lesson on what asthma is, but it is a very prevalent disease. And most importantly, people may not be aware, but it actually is still a lethal disease. And so each day, 10 Americans die from asthma. And of course, the economic cost is huge as well. And so what we want to do is actually build an exacerbation prediction tool, a tool that will enable someone, okay, whether it is the physician, whether it is the patient, whether it is the payer, to predict that a patient is about to have an exacerbation. And the value, of course, is that then you can start changing their regimen. If you're the physician, the patient can get personal advice on how to better manage their disease. The payer, obviously economic value. And we have a lot of competition, by the way, which means this is an important feature to actually understand. So how are we doing this? As I said, two main methodologies right now, and the first one that I'll describe is through electronic medical records, EMRs, and this is a Teva and IBM collaboration. And what we wanted was basically to use electronic medical records, so data that already exists for each and every patient, in order to predict an exacerbation for a patient. We did that using Exploris, which is basically it's a provider network, but it's a database of beyond 60 million patients and their electronic medical records. You can see there's a ton of data that is within the Exploris. It's one of the biggest databases for electronic medical records in the world, which IBM has acquired. And within that, there are 2.7 million asthma patients as well as COPD patients. So what we did was we first had to define the positive. So what does an exacerbation look like? And this is a big problem when you're looking at electronic medical records. It's how you start extracting the features and how you clean them from the noise within them. So for example, an asthma diagnosis doesn't necessarily mean the patient has asthma. Physicians make mistakes in their diagnosis, and also sometimes just from a technical perspective, they make mistakes in their electronic medical records. So how do you define asthma patients, and how do you define specific levels of asthma patients so that you know that you're looking at a homogeneous population within clinical electronic medical records that don't tell you whether a patient is moderate or severe? You start having to extract those, and you do that always with the help of clinicians that actually know the disease and know how the system is being used. So we built two main models. One was the baseline model, which basically asks, what is the risk of a patient, based on the electronic medical records, of having any exacerbation in the future? The look-back period here was 1 year. So basically asking the question, if we look back at the electronic medical record for a year, what is the likelihood the patient will have an exacerbation sometime in the future? This is actually not a very useful model, which is again why the clinical perspective is critical, because you can assume that if the patient is really an asthma patient, it's very likely that they will have an exacerbation in the future. So it can be sort of a proof of concept when your accuracy is high because you predict most asthma patients are going to continue to be asthma patients. But much more relevant is actually this 30 days model. In this model, we're actually looking back 180 days, so 6 months, looking at 6 months of data from the electronic medical records and asking what is the likelihood that this patient will have an exacerbation in the upcoming 30 days. Much more relevant clinically, obviously, because now you can actually, this is actionable. So if a physician gets an alert, he can tell the patient, you need to manage your disease better somehow, or take prophylactic medicine. But it's also, of course, much more challenging. So what we did was, you can see here the negatives and the positive, looking back at the 180 days, and then forward for 30 days trying to predict the various features within Explorers to diagnosis, the encounters, so basically medical utilization, drugs, comorbidities, the patient habits, so for example, smoking, their labs and their demographics, and apply gradient boosted trees on these to basically develop a model that will enable the prediction. Now, when you do that, what you find is that this is the performance. So you're seeing here ultimately the performance in this 30-day model. So if I look at electronic medical records for patients, 6 months, looking back 6 months, the AUC is 0.77. Now, you may not think that that's very exciting, and I'll agree with you in that, and that's why we're also looking at digital markers, which I'll talk about next. However, you need to consider that when we recruit to our clinical trials, and in that recruitment, we're looking for patients that are going to have an exacerbation, right? Because we want to basically enrich our clinical studies for events. When we do that, and when we use physicians that are constantly monitoring their own patients, so not looking at some EMRs that are detached, but actually knowing their patients, the best they can predict is actually 20%. And so within that context, actually this 0.77 AUC is much, much better. However, we still aim for more. So the second thing that we do is actually looking at digital markers. And this is a work in progress, so I'll only sort of give you the framework. But what we're trying to do here is actually look at sleep-wake patterns of patients, because there is a known association between sleep-wake and exacerbation. Now, we're not talking about causality here, but we assume that we can use the sleep-wake patterns of a patient in order to associate it with an upcoming exacerbation. So what's interesting about this is that the first thing you need to do is actually define or refine sleep-wake patterns. Why do I say that? Because look at this. This is the classic sort of sleep-wake, and this is an actigraph. Now you can see the dark is wake and the light is sleep. You can see that even when there is no activity, presumably, there is still some wake. So this isn't binary, right? So we're seeing that even on the other hand, when there is a lot of activity, there's also still some sleep. So defining just through sleep-wake is not sufficient. And so in this case, we use, by the way, the Philips ActiWatch on patients. And what you can see is these are the sort of traditional data annotation that you get. And when you look at it and you just eyeball it, you can already see that actually within sleep and within wake, there are actually much more activities than just sleep-wake. And so how do you refine this? The first refinement is what we call falling asleep. So you can see there are times of low density or low activity that follow the high activity. So yes, the patient is awake, and so this is still the wake cycle, but something is happening. He's not asleep, but he's not fully awake. On the other hand, we also have these siesta periods that you're seeing here. So what do we do with that information? The modeling approach that we took is convolutional neural networks. And the reason is that these are actually designed to process data from multiple arrays and really about image processing, right? But the reason that this is interesting is that what I showed you earlier had context. So falling asleep happens after you've had a period of activity and before you're sleeping. You can't define it without the context. And so what we did, and I'm running out of time, what we did is we used the convent in order to model that. And you can see the precision and the sensitivity was very high. When we use this, you can see the comparison with other modeling approaches, which is much superior and requires less training iterations when we're using the CNN. And just to conclude, within healthcare there is a digital revolution that is being, that analytics and big data is key for. Predictive analytics can support personalized medicine and is being used by Teva as well as other pharma. And ultimately, the leading information sources right now are real-world data such as electronic medical records and claims records, but the next ones, as we know, are already in use, which are medical images, just discussed, voice, and social media. Thank you.